All right, thank you guys so much for joining and watching today. Obviously, I am Luca, and I'm going to be presenting on my research topic of what factors might most affect the capacity of an English L1 to learn Mandarin as an L2. So with that, let's get started. So first, just to break down a bit of the abstract so you understand the flow of this presentation, the goal of my research was to analyze what might most impact the capacity of an English L1, a non-tonal language, to learn Mandarin, a tonal language, as just a case study of all tonal languages in general when considering a non-tonal L1 learning them. I used a qualitative method using a meta-analysis to conduct my research of smaller analyses, and my results so far appear that age tends to be the most impactful, along with some other factors being of impact. And the implications of this mean that there may be a general future hypothesis of all tonal L2s in terms of non-tonal L1s and the capacity of learning it, into what factors might impact it. And the research question that guided my study was, to what extent does age, grammar, tonal recognition, and pronunciation influence the capacity of an English L1 to learn Mandarin as an L2? So with that being said, let's dive into a bit of background information. So when I was doing my research for this, there were some notable takeaways that I had. There were a couple of factors that stood out above the rest because there was an abundance of literature on different languages. However, most of it appeared to be English and Mandarin, hence why I chose my subject. In terms of the four factors that appeared to be the most prevalent, age was one of them. And a good example of this was being a 2017 study by Dr. Singh of Yale University, where it found that in terms of English L1s learning Mandarin L2, there may be suggestions that a lot of factors such as tonal recognition, tonal capacity, and other things that have to do with the tonal versus non-tonal language differences may be impacted by age, as well as other studies, which we'll get into later, as well as a general hypothesis. In terms of tonal recognition, which would be very important due to the capacity to learn a language auditorily, a study by Professor Jung Im Han of Konkuk University found, when comparing and contrasting Korean and English L1s when they were learning Mandarin as an L2, found that the tonal, which is Korean, L1 tended to be much more successful than non-tonal L1s when learning Mandarin as a tonal L2 in terms of tonal recognition and auditory cues. And in terms of grammar, there are several pieces of literature that suggest that grammar may play too. So a study from McGill University found that when comparing tonal and non-tonal L1s in several of them to Icelandic, it found that the tonal L1s tended to be much more successful overall to learning a non-tonal L2, tonal L2, specifically for the grammar, which is very important for written communication. And in terms of pronunciation, a study from the University of Pittsburgh finds that when, in terms of English L1s learning Mandarin, that after learning Mandarin, English L1s became much more aware of tones in their respective languages. And also, there's also several studies from the University of Pittsburgh that also suggest that there may be a correlation between age and being capable to pronounce things. Now, all of this ties back to one specific linguistic characteristic, the critical period hypothesis, which, according to the Oxford Dictionary of Linguistics, says that that after a certain age period in your youth, you tend to, if you're not exposed to certain languages and certain tones and sounds, then it will be much more difficult for you to learn language and may impact your capacity overall in the future. And because of this, this was really important for me in my research in order to determine what factor might most impact this, as this is generally cited as what impacts the capacity to learn language. So with that being said, I dove into a few specifics of my methodology. As previously stated, this is a qualitative study using literature-based data and findings over quantitative findings. This was a meta-analysis, meaning that I compared and contrasted different sources and used them to synthesize to come up with a certain conclusion. And with this meta-analysis, I did smaller analyses of four factors, which I'll get into in a minute, and then did an overall analysis of each of the four smaller analyses to create one large meta-analysis. With that being said, the factors considered, this is going to mirror what I did in my lit review, is that for age, and we looked if there were any connections to youth as suggested by the critical period hypothesis. Tonal recognition is important, we decided important to consider due to the fact that it was that the tonal recognition is huge for auditory recognition and auditory fluency, grammar being a huge factor in a lot of written as well as some verbal communication of a tonal language, especially if tones are not explicit in the grammar, and then pronunciation as an important factor of verbal communication, as that's how the tones are replicated. And because of that, I came across some interesting results and findings. So first off, in terms of the least impactful, we found that grammar appeared to be the least impactful factor, factor as to affecting the capacity of an English L1 to learn Mandarin as an L2. And it proved to be more negligible as over long term, grammar got better, which is to be expected due to syntax by the research. But it turned out to be much more of an impact on the difficulty of picking up the language rather than the capacity to learn it as a whole. Moderately impactful included pronunciation and tonal recognition, and this is best stated by Professor Jung Im of Jung Ham of Chunuk University, and it found that when comparing English L1s to other tonal L1s when learning Mandarin L2, both pronunciation and tonal recognition was much more successful amongst previously tonal L1s in comparison to English L1s, which suggested that having a tonal background in comparison to English may lead to better success and capacity overall. However, something that was noticed was that the youth groups of English tended to be much more successful in tonal pronunciation and recognition when comparing to just more general groups, which led to, as we're going to see here, the most impactful factor determined was age. According to the University of British Columbia, children 12 and under have the best odds of being an English speaker to learn Mandarin as an L2. And this additionally has been found to influence other factors in tonal recognition and pronunciation. In terms of learning that and being able to learn it, youth groups showed the highest accuracy. In addition, on grammar, it showed that in the long term, as one got older, grammar got better, which therefore suggested that age must have had the largest factor, as it was not only influencing its own way due to the critical period hypothesis, but also it was influencing the other three factors studied. So, what does this mean in terms of discussion? The first thing I'd like to dive into is I'd like to quickly address two limitations. The first one, obviously, being time. I had a 9-week period to do my research, and because of this limited the capacity of what this research could be in terms of extent, and limited me to collecting only qualitative data rather than some quantitative data as well, which I feel would have given me another limitation is standardization. Doing a meta-analysis does limit in being able to come up with an affirmative conclusion due to a lack of standardization, meaning that there's no real numbers to back up any sort of conclusion. So because of this, this is solely based off of what previous researchers have said and then making judgments based off of the connections it's synthesizing. Now, on to what this implies is that there's 3 distinct categories of what impacts English L1's capacity to learn Mandarin as an L2. The first one is the negligible category, and this is determined by long-term evidence, which is grammar, and it found that it's just more so a difficulty of learning the language as it would be in several other languages, like you can see in your English classes, or if you learn Spanish, you find that learning grammar tends to be the hard part. But overall, as you learn it and with more practice, you get it. Versus something that's more moderate is tonal recognition and pronunciation, which tends to be a big factor, but is also influenced by something else. And it turns out to be, it's just genuinely a biological thing rather than just a practice-based thing like grammar. And then for the most impactful, we have age, as it influenced all 3 other factors, as well as the critical period hypothesis has suggested that the younger someone starts to learn a Mandarin L2 as an English L1, the more likely they are to have a higher capacity, as well as long-term success overall, as distinguished by our research. And this leads to an overarching connection with age. Age obviously affecting the capacity due to the critical period hypothesis, tonal recognition affecting the long-term and critical period hypothesis, also being influenced by age overall. And then pronunciation, again, in the long-term results, the age shows the younger you were, the higher capacity you have in the long term to be able to reproduce these tones. So with that being said, this future implication is that there may be a possible general hypothesis for all non-tonal to tonal L1 to L2 relations, suggesting that there may be a general principle that age is the most impactful for a non-tonal L1 to learn a tonal L2, and to how young they are exposed to this language, as well as to start learning it, which this would need to be backed up by several other case studies, as well as just other linguistic studies about the critical period hypothesis. With that being said, here are my references. Thank you so much for listening.